Welcome to the Executive Coaching Podcast, where executive coach Alicia Cowan will discuss leadership topics and coaching solutions to tackle the most difficult problems that keep you from leading your team to success.
Hello there, executive leaders. It's Alicia Cowan. Welcome to episode number 91 of the Executive Coaching Podcast. We're recording this in early May. I'm going to give you a quick update as to what's going around here around the Cowan house. It is Mother's Day weekend this weekend, so happy belated Mother's Day to all my moms out there. And it is May-cember, as somebody made the joke to me, that May feels like all of the end-of-year activities for kids happen all at once. And so it feels like a lot of seasons colliding as we head into hopefully summer in the next few weeks. But we've got it all. Field trips, end-of-year dances, tests and finals, and we're planning for end-of-year celebrations. So it's a lot as we're staring down the barrel of summer. And I'm really excited. We've got about 3-ish more weeks until we are fully into summer. And I know a lot of you clients are with me there. I've talked to you, you're feeling the pressure, you've got a lot going on. And today, let's take a little break and breather together. So we let's talk through executive coaching. I know a lot of you are in the job hunt. I've been coaching a lot of you around finding the next right move. And then a lot of you who aren't in the job hunt, you're in transition and growth stage. And so that's kind of the big conversations that I've been having. So I want to talk about how executive coaching can really help. I want to make the case today that executive coaching is actually one of the very highest ROI capital allocation decisions that an executive and a business can make, especially when it's pointed at the right person. And we'll talk about what I mean by that as we get into this podcast. But a lot of companies believe that executive coaching is sometimes just the repair job. And I disagree on that. And so I'm going to talk a lot about that today. So let's set the stage here. Executive presence is not just about charisma. I've said this on the podcast before. I believe executive presence is truly an operational asset. And in today's lens, EBITDA, not soft skills. We're not talking about how to walk into a room. We're talking about truly what happens to your margin, what happens to your talent, what happens to your valuation when the right leader is operating at their highest level and its impact on EBITDA. So when I'm going to frame this up today, this is more of a business conversation. I think executive coaching is not this light and fluffy thing that's just seen as some type of development activity that can be easily pushed to the side. And obviously not disparaging development activities. I'm just saying sometimes people see it as a nice to have, not an absolute need to have. And this conversation is for a lot of different audiences. I think it can be for executives that are in it, operators. It can be for private equity sponsors. It could be for CEOs that are scaling through a transition and trying to get their leadership team right? This could be a lot of different people that this can apply to. Because really, I think that the purpose of this is to understand that executive coaching and your executive presence and that asset can absolutely be leveraged to drive EBITDA. Okay. So let's get into it. Before I get into what I believe are some drivers of this, I want to define executive presence and what I believe it means, because I think executive presence is such a broad term and not everybody defines it in the same way. I'm also going to explain EBITDA for my friends that are not in finance or that haven't really had this term used a lot and have understood it. So let's start with executive presence. So executive presence, and what I mean on my own terms here, is it's not just being polished or what you wear or commanding the room. All those things can be absolutely helpful. So I'm not discrediting those things. What I mean is executive presence is more about how you carry yourself and how people experience you. So it can be the ability to create alignment in a room, so the level of influence, how clear others experience your messaging and communication, and how forward motion looks in some of those high stakes, highly critical moments within an organization, and how much you as the leader influence them. That's executive presence. It shows up for leaders in how decisions get made and how quickly they get made, for that matter, how teams respond under pressure. So, how are they moving and how are they acting under the influence of your leadership when things are high stakes? And then how stakeholders are experiencing you as the leader. So it's more than just, being charming and, like I said, having charisma and walking into the room. It's more than that. The room has to be able to move and the organization has to move in that right direction because of the leadership and the influence. So that's just to ground us and level set around executive presence. That's what I mean when I say executive presence. Now, EBITDA, this is defined as, if you're going to look at this acronym and you don't know it, it's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So stick with me here. If you're not a finance person or if you haven't heard this term, just listen for 10 seconds. What it is, it's basically the truest measure of how much cash a business actually generates from its operations. So if you want to hear it again in layman's terms, if you strip out the accounting noise, the taxes, the debt payments, then what's truly left is EBITDA. So it's the number that tells you, like, does the business actually work? And it's the number that will drive valuation. So when I say executive presence is an EBITDA driver, I mean it moves the needle on the number that determines what your company is worth. All right, now that is a big statement. So we're going to talk about it. And then we're going to talk about transitioning. Like, again, executive presence as being this like soft skill to making it operational. So here's a couple of ways that I think about this. Number one, I think every minute that we sit in ambiguity and not making forward decisions in an organization is directly correlated to a dollar cost and has a dollar cost. So every minute that we sit in indecision, it's costing us money of inaction. The second thing I think is that talent is such a key driver. So every key hire that is either lost because they turn over or they're disengaged or quiet quitting, like if we're not getting the productivity out of our hires due to poor leadership and how those associates are experiencing that poor leadership in an organization, that also has a massive dollar cost. And then third, every single board meeting that doesn't build confidence has an absolute dollar cost. And so executive presence is what eliminates some of these costs at a major scale. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So bottom line here, executive presence is not simply how somebody looks in the room. And I believe, again, that can absolutely be a part of the influence, but it's not everything. It's truly how fast does the room move and take action after the leader leaves the room. Let's get into the three drivers and what I mean. And we're going to break down those three things that I mentioned a little bit further. So let's start with driver one. Decision velocity is what I'm going to call driver one. So like I mentioned, if there's a decision that is sitting out there into the world in the company, and that those decisions are sitting in ambiguity, they have compounding costs. So imagine it. There's a decision and a major decision that needs to be made. Until that decision is made, the teams have halted or they are misaligned because there's not a decision. And so there's not alignment around one direction forward. So you have everybody going in different directions. Or perhaps they're defaulting to something that is safe, to something that is slow, and those choices also have costs. Okay. So here's the deal. High presence executives have the ability to read the room really quickly, right? So high amount of empathy, high amount of EQ can like look at the room, read the room fast. And then they also have the ability to signal conviction and get to a yes and influence in a short amount of time frame, perhaps just one meeting, right? So this is the difference when you have an executive that has that ability. They can move everything forward quickly and not spin out in indecision. So there's an estimate out there, right? So if you're thinking in some simple numbers, if you have a $50 million revenue business and they're making maybe 3 to 4 major decisions per quarter, they can lose up to 2 to 3 weeks of execution per decision that sits in ambiguity. So think about it. That's a real margin there, right? That is absolutely eating into profits and margin. And I can't tell you, I see this all the time. And again, we're using some generalities with these numbers, but if you think about it, it can cost so much money as we sit in this either a safe decision, indecision, or misaligned decision. So I want to talk about an example of this. I had this leader that I was coaching and working with that came in and was stepping into a new role, leading hundreds of people. And to start, at first they were second guessing their own decisions. They were relying on other people's opinions instead of their own knowledge. And what was great about it, they did have experts on their team. And absolutely, we want to use our experts and lean on them for their expertise and listen to them. But unfortunately, these experts, for sure, they knew their area of the business, but they didn't know every area of the business like this leader did. So a lot of times she found herself almost deferring to these leaders rather than like trusting and making her own decision based on her knowledge of like the entire organization and her broader viewpoint. So what we did together is through coaching together, we talked and really helped support her in trusting her own decisions and her own instincts. So she knew this company, she'd had lots of tenure. She knew the culture really well, and she was dangerous enough in all of the different areas that she covered, so that she could take in others' opinions and really like listen to the experts, take in their opinions without just deferring automatically to their inputs. She was able to like then blend and meld them into her own so that it was the most magical collaboration point where she could take her expertise, listen to others, and then move out. And she found that balance of trust with herself and with her team. And so that's where, again, coaching can come into play. It's where you find the balance. It doesn't mean that you don't listen to others' opinions, but you absolutely get to the point where you can trust it rather than spinning out and being indecisive and questioning your own opinion. So that's lever one in an example of driver number one. So let's talk about driver number two. This is all about talent leverage, perhaps one of my favorite drivers. And I love talking about people and talent, get really excited about this. So we've seen it, and we've probably worked for or worked within organizations where you see a strong, powerful leader that has great influence within an organization. And strong leaders that are good at their jobs, they attract other strong people and leaders in their organization. And it's not cliche. We've seen it, right? It's a flywheel. So if you think about leadership within an organization and the amount of scope and scale that they can influence, let's think about maybe an executive or a VP level. If you have turnover within that executive level due to somebody not being a strong leader and people leaving the organization, that turnover costs the company real dollars. So there's some estimates and studies out there that say a VP level turnover could cost the company up to 6 to 9 months of that person's salary in costs like recruiting costs, that ramp up time, getting them onboarded again, and all that lost momentum in the time of when you need to switch over from one leader to the next. So executive presence and having strong leadership is absolutely a retention mechanism. You think about your own experience. People stay working for leaders who make them better. And executive presence is like this true magnet. I see it all the time with the executives that I'm coaching. When they're looking at new roles or being recruited into new companies, these like A players, they are so selective about who they report to. And trust me, even in this job market, top talent, they have choices. They have ability to select who they work for, and boy, are they selective, as they should be, because your experience of going into work and working for somebody that you are inspired by, that you're excited to work with and for, like that is a game changer, right? And so if you have one strong executive hire that has a high level of executive presence, that is going to equate to massive compounding returns on every single seat below them. And sometimes peers to them, right? A lot of times as executives, we are interviewing with other peers and to see who is going to be the leadership team that we're working with. And that can influence somebody's decision on whether or not they are going to join the company and subsequently stay with the company. Okay. So let me give an example. I was coaching, actually, I've coached a couple leaders in PE-backed companies that are in leadership roles. And a lot of what their job is they're put in place to bring in talent to make organizational changes and do some org design of their own and build up teams, right? And make massive sweeping changes to get the growth moving, right? So I coach and help leaders in these situations. First off, not being afraid to manage and hire top talent. So sometimes what I experience is that I have a high performer, and sometimes they get in their head about managing and hiring high performers. And so what happens in coaching is teaching and coaching about how not to be intimidated or fearful of high performers that work for them. So in some cultures, people are taught to be threatened by the competition, and they're taught like you have to be, watch out for that person because it's going to be this like dog eat dog type of situation. And sometimes we have to break that break that belief and habit and teach people like if you're a high performer and you manage high performers, there's nothing but goodness that can come out of that. So and how to get over that, that mindset shift of not being intimidated and afraid to manage great talent. The second thing I help leaders do through coaching is to not be afraid to directly manage and give feedback to people that are underperforming. It's really challenging, right, to have somebody that's not performing well and to give direct feedback and get over some of those challenges of those like crucial conversations that can sometimes just feel uncomfortable and be challenging for people, and all the subsequent things that happen after you manage somebody that is underperforming, right? So for many reasons, these two scenarios, the high performer and the underperformer, they can really challenge executives and hold them back from like having a really high performing team. And so through coaching and making sure that the talent and the org structure is set up correctly and all the succession planning and all that talent goodness that needs to happen in high performing growth organizations can really happen and help people get there a lot quicker rather than spinning out, stumbling, and second guessing and sitting with talent that doesn't necessarily or not leveraging all the talent and not being as productive as the team could be. So that's driver number two. The third driver that I'm going to talk about today is capital confidence. So, more than just this fun little saying, capital confidence, what that looks like is the board will fund leaders that they believe in. And whether or not the board wants to admit it or not, this a lot of times is an emotional decision before it's this like analytical decision. So what do I mean by that? Well, private equity sponsors will allocate resources towards their portfolio companies with leadership teams and executives that they believe in and that they trust, and they know they can take that organization to that next level, right? Strategic partners, customers, and lenders also makes faster decisions when the leader commands the room and they leave that room with a sense of confidence and just faith and trust that they've got it, right? So executive presence in this high stakes type of meeting with these people that I mentioned, it doesn't just win over the deal, it actually can improve the terms of the deal. So let's talk about an example of this. So again, I was helping a leader in a private equity backed company, and their job was to really show the board how they can get things done, how they lead, how they drive results. And what we worked on with coaching together as somebody that hadn't presented to a board in this way, what we had to do is shift and change their beliefs that as an executive, they are no longer just any employee within the organization. They are a leader in the company and leading this business. And they had to reframe it from not just from that employee mentality to leader mentality. And what this looked like is approaching the board, not as if the board was like their boss and they're a direct report to the board, but more as a leader. And they have to influence the board. They have to show their leadership to the board, and they have to treat them like a peer group of colleagues and people they're consulting with, not defer to them like a boss and a direct reporting relationship. Right? There is a distinct difference, and people can feel it, whether you say it or not. People can feel when you're being deferential and what the mentality is that you're carrying when you walk into a room and present to the room. And so that job of walking into those meetings is more to be a leader and influence and guide the conversation, not in this like mentality and attitude of asking for permission or being told what to do. And I think we know this, right? But I think sometimes we can get in our own way and get in our own head, and it can come out in lots of different ways. It can come out how we're presenting, how we're carrying ourselves, the messaging, the line of questioning, everything that we're doing to get ready for that presentation. But really, it starts with the mindset. And so again, that's how coaching can help build that executive presence. It's like really setting the tone of how you are going to set yourself up to walk into that room and drive that agenda. So that's the third driver. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the solution and what this can look like. So like I said at the top of this, I think there's a couple of different ways to think about executive coaching. I believe personally that the wrong way to think about executive coaching is to think about it as remediation. I think some executives and organizations deploy it as like a fix for someone. The thought like we have a performance problem with someone, so let's bring in a coach. I think what that does is it positions coaching as like a triage. And my thought on this is potentially it can help, but a lot of times this mentality and approach will result in a more low ROI. I think it brings down the prestige of coaching. And I think it's more of a defensive spend than offensive. And again, from my perspective, I think the way to think about executive coaching and executive presence is truly as an asset enhancement. So I think about an executive. I think a lot of high performing executives that I coach, they're already at like a 2x performance level. And we can coach and work together and expedite their growth. And I believe we can go to more of a 10x. So if you think about it, a 2x executive going to 10x, I believe that creates more value within an organization than if you take like a mediocre C player and you try to push them from like 0.8x to like getting them just up to a 1x or 1.1x, right? The amount of value that can be created out of a really great leader is just so much more powerful than trying to push from underperforming just to mediocre. So my thought around executive coaching is not, is the person, broken and can we fix them? I think the real question that we need to ask as leaders is, where is the ceiling on this asset? And let's try to work on that rather than trying to fix. So the best companies out there are thinking about this and doing this. High performers, top talent, they'll get the development and resources they need in order to be successful. These companies are protecting these assets, and they're understanding what their worth and their value is, and they're moving that forward. They're not just working on trying to get us as underperformance up to like just mediocre, right? They're trying to see what they can do in terms of growth, and where that top is, who knows, right? So my reframe there is, coaching should not be about remediation. Coaching and executive presence is about performance enhancement on your most valuable and expensive assets. And the ROI math is not even close. So here's what executive coaching can actually bring in a really strong executive. So these are real examples of what I've seen in a before and after situation. So clear focus on what absolutely matters. They, as an executive, will stop being busy and start being more effective because they understand exactly what the priorities are for them and their teams and the org. Next is decision quality. We talked about this. They will make faster decisions, more confident decisions, and fewer reversals on their decisions. So all of that is just protecting a massive asset of time, right? They are able to make these decisions faster because they trust themselves, they trust the teams. Next, communication precision. When leaders understand how to clearly communicate with confidence, they will say less, they will move more. Next is stakeholder influence. This is the big deal right here, right? So within the organization, you're not just working with your team as an executive, you're working in cross-functional teams. And so they stop just like managing up, and they start influencing up and start leading up, right? And they are able to influence across up and down, right? They have that ability to get people moving and get people rallied behind them. And my last point here is that executive presence really shows up when people are in high stakes moments and under pressure. These leaders, they don't shrink in those moments that matter the most. They actually are the ones that are leaning in, rising to the occasion, and showing up in the most powerful of ways. Okay. And then I will say there is one big thread that ties all of these drivers together, and that is the skill set of relentless prioritization. This one's a big one. So if coaching is all about like amplifying a really strong top talent executive, then the question becomes, what exactly are you amplifying? Because here's the deal. You can make somebody more confident, more polished, and more articulate. However, there's one key thread. If they're still spending their time on the wrong things, none of that matters. None of it moves the needle. So that is where this thread of relentless prioritization comes in. And I say this, it's not a time management concept, right? Because those can help, but ultimately, ruthless and relentless prioritization, that's more of the like the operating system that makes everything we talked about actually compound. So here's the deal. The highest leverage leaders are just radically and super selective about where they put their attention. And once they learn some of these skills, again, they understand that yes, they have to show up and influence, but not everything that screams at them and knocks on their door and begs for their attention, not all of that is strategic. So, what coaching does is we build all these executive presence skills, and we also build this muscle of ruthless prioritization, saying no to the good and the not so great, so you can say yes to the absolute best and the focus, right? And so this is where I see some of the biggest unlocks in the executives that I work with. And like I mentioned, the executives I work with already are high performing. They come in doing everything typically pretty well, but they would leave doing the absolute right things that are their priorities exceptionally well. And that is the compounding effect of all of this, of what we talked about today. So what happens is you have a senior executive, they're operating at their highest leverage activities. The ripple effect that goes through the organization, through their team, their direct reports, is just massive. And here's why. So they come in with great executive presence. Then they model this like ruthless prioritization. So then their teams believe in them. They are able to prioritize better themselves. They've got this clear direction, this decision making, and then they're all prioritizing and moving faster and better themselves. The decision quality improves and it trickles down to every level below them. And that, my friends, is EBITDA in motion. That's what I mean by all of this compounding is really what will absolutely drive everything forward. And this is the work I love. This is why I love working with leaders, is because they have such a massive impact on the organization. You're not just working with one person, you are influencing hundreds, if not thousands of people. And I think sometimes we forget about how important it is to work on some of these skills, because again, sometimes they're intangible. They feel soft, they feel fluffy, but I'm telling you, they 100% are tied to the returns. Okay. All right, friends. So we're almost wrapping things up here. So I want to say this in summary: executive presence is 100%. This is a financial lever. This is not some fluffy, like finishing school topic that is a nice to have. It impacts decision velocity. It impacts talent leverage. It impacts the capital confidence, and everything is downstream from that. And so the right executive coaching conversation is not about fixing an associate. It's about maximizing leaders and leadership. And so the last thing is that relentless prioritization that ties it all together. It's what separates the true exceptional leaders who are impressive from leaders that aren't. And it's truly transformational. So that's what I have for you today, my friends. I love talking about this topic. And if this resonated with you, it's probably because you're already working with some really strong people and you can see the gap between where they are and what they could be. And that is one of the conversations I love the absolute most. So feel free to reach out. As always, the link is in the show notes, and you can find me through any of these podcasting platforms or YouTube or LinkedIn, or you can go directly to my website. Really easy way to get a hold of me. It's EliciaCowanCoaching.com. It's ELISIAKEOWN coaching.com. And I would love to hear from you. Friends, think about it. You can reflect on all of this yourself and say, what is the most expensive decision you have seen a leader delay or procrastinate because they lacked their own conviction? Think about it. And what's that impacting? Love to hear from you. All right. As always, I appreciate you. I will see you next time. And thanks for listening. Bye, friends.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Executive Coaching Podcast with Alicia Cowan. If you're ready to have an executive coach who's ready to help you lead your team to success, then book an introductory call at aliciacowancoaching.com/call.